Morning, everybody. My name is Cassandra Hunt. I'm a Strategic Advisor with Medical Cannabis Australia and also an Adjunct Fellow at the Nickham Health Research Institute. It's my great pleasure to be moderating this first session for you. It's the first of two sessions that we will have on the Australian medicinal cannabis market landscape. And I'm joined on stage by Rhys Cohen, who is the Policy Officer at the Pennington Institute, Tom Brown, co-founder of Honolulu, and Sharon Miller, who's the proprietor and consultant pharmacist at Medigreen Clinic and Dispensary. Over the next hour, you're going to have some brief presentations from myself, Rhys and Tom. We're going to share with you some data on the industry, and then we're going to dive into a panel discussion, and we're going to talk about some of the key insights that have come out of the data that we'll share with you. And we'll also talk about how some of these market dynamics are shaping the patient experience on the ground. We will have some time for Q&A, so please make sure that you log your questions in the app. We will do our absolute best to get to as many questions as we possibly can. And I believe that we will have some roving microphones, so if there's something that just occurs to you in the moment, you should be able to grab a microphone and ask that question. So I'm going to kick off with a slide that's been prepared by Nostradata. For those of you who don't know Nostradata, they use point of sale data in pharmacies in order to report on the market. They report on things like the market as a whole, they look at patient data, prescriber data and so on. They would love to have been here today to present this information to you themselves, but unfortunately they weren't able to be, and so you get me sharing this information with you. I will point out there are a few limitations with the data set, and that is that the data doesn't represent every pharmacy in the market, so it's not a true picture of the whole industry. That said, the sample size is 4,500 pharmacies, which is a pretty good chunk of the almost 6,000 pharmacies across Australia. We do know, however, that there are some pharmacies that dispense very, very high volumes of medical cannabis, and so if they're not included in this data set, it does skew the numbers a little. That said, it's really useful information for us to look at industry trends and to track those trends over time. You're going to hear quite a lot about data limitations in this session. We've already heard from Peter where some of the gaps in the data are. We don't have a single source of truth in this industry, and it makes it really difficult for us to report on what's happening in the industry. What we need to do is we need to take lots of different data sets and we need to pull them together to paint the best picture we can, and that's what we're going to do for you this morning. There are some big gaps. We don't know the exact number of patients, for example, and there's some areas that we hope to address as an industry over the next little while. So the key takeouts in this data set, I'm actually going to start in the top right corner. The top right corner, you can see that the market is growing very steadily and has been growing very steadily for some time. Interestingly though, if you look at the last two bars, which are the second half of 2023, you'll see that there's the tiniest little hint of tapering off of that growth. We don't know whether that's indicative of a trend, whether we'll see that correct itself through 2024, but it's something that we certainly want to keep an eye on. I'll then go to the graph that's below that. This is telling us that medical cannabis is becoming mainstream. Over 75% of the 4,500 pharmacies in this data set are dispensing medical cannabis, and we can see also that there's been continued and ongoing prescriber growth. The patient base is growing alongside that. You'll see in the bottom left-hand corner here, there's been over 200% growth in the number of patients from the start of 2022 to the end of 2023. And finally, the top left corner, market share. This is one that I know people look at with very eagle eyes. What this market share graph is telling us is that there are a small number of companies who have lion's share in terms of market share in the industry. The top 10 who are represented on this graph make up over 80% of market share, which means that the remaining 18-point-something%, there are a lot of companies who are competing for a very small part of the market. Now, if you are a product sponsor and you're looking at this graph and thinking, hang on a sec, I've got a really good business, I should be up there on that graph in the top 10. The reason you might not be up there is because of the way that the data is coded. So if you're a product sponsor, you need to make sure that you are letting the software companies know who provide point of sale software across the pharmacies in this data set, what products you have, and then those products will be coded correctly at point of sale, and you might see some shifts in that data, and there likely will be some shifts in data over time as sponsors start to do that. I'm now going to hand to Reece, who's going to take us through some top-level numbers for the market.
Hi everyone. Testing. Is that working? Can you all hear me okay? Yes, great. Excellent, thanks. I'm sorry, Cass, I'm not going to stand directly in front of you, but I'm going to stand here if that's okay. Just prefer doing it that way. Morning everybody. Excited to be here today. My name's Reece Cohen. I'm the Policy Officer at Pennington Institute, and I'm going to be taking you through some insights into the publicly available data sets that we have about the medical cannabis market in Australia. So for those who don't know Pennington Institute, we're a Melbourne-based not-for-profit drug policy organisation, and we're focused on maximising community health and safety when it comes to the use of drugs in society. That includes alcohol and prescription medications, illicit drugs, and of course, cannabis. So, as Cass very astutely pointed out, we don't have a single source of truth for data in this market at the moment, and we probably won't for some time. What we can do, however, is take a look at different data sets that are available and build up a bit of a patchwork to get a sense of what's actually happening. So that's what I want to do for you here today, is just quickly take you through 4 different data sets, explain what they tell us, what they don't, what their strengths are and their limitations, and perhaps by combining them together we can get a more comprehensive and accurate picture of what's happening. So I'll start off by talking about overall use in the Australian community at the highest level possible, and then look at the patient approvals data that we've already heard about. I'm going to spend a bit more time talking about a data set that I've spent the most time with, which is nationally representative sales data for the medical cannabis industry, and I'll talk you through that. And then finally, just touch on some market sizing and growth forecast estimates. So let's get started. First of all, overall use. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare runs a big nationally representative survey every 3 years or so called the National Drug Strategy Household Survey. The last one just got published literally, I think it was last week or maybe the week before. Time's a bit of a blur at the moment. And they ask lots of questions about all kinds of things. And the last 2 reports have included questions about medicinal cannabis use. So what we know from this survey is that in the last 12 months, and they call that recent use, so in the last 12 months, Australians aged 14 and over, about 12% of us used cannabis for any reason. It's about 2.6 million Australians used cannabis in the last 12 months. Of those people who used cannabis, about 25% say that their reasons for using cannabis are medical, at least some of the time. It's about 700,000 people who are currently saying that they used cannabis in the last 12 months for medical reasons. Of those medical people who use cannabis for medical reasons, 30% now say that they have accessed cannabis via prescription at least once in the last 12 months. That's about 200,000 people doing the rough maths. That's a really considerable growth from when we saw this data just a few years ago. As you can see in that bar chart, in 2019 it barely registered. It was not even statistically significant in terms of the number of people who said they were getting a prescription, and that's now jumped to about 30%, which is tremendous. Of course, as Peter rightly pointed out, the other side of that coin is 70% of people who are currently using cannabis for medical purposes are still not accessing regulated products under the care of a healthcare professional. So there is considerable work still to be done, and that's just for the people who are already currently using cannabis for medical purposes, let alone people who might benefit from it and who aren't using it or didn't use it in the last 12 months. Challenges with this data set, you'll notice that 200,000 people in the last 12 months. Maybe you're thinking, oh, it seems a bit low, perhaps. And I would agree with you. I think some of the known limitations with exactly these kinds of data sets is underreporting, because of the federal government is conducting a survey of your criminal behaviour, your illicit drug use. People aren't likely to be as forthcoming as they might be if they were asked other questions. So that's what the data tells us at the top level in terms of overall use in the community. I'll touch just very briefly on approvals for medical cannabis. These are the federal government patient access approvals. Yeah, as most people in this room would probably be aware, the approvals continue to grow over time. The growth in recent years has been predominantly through the authorised prescriber scheme, not the special access scheme. And that's a direct result, in my opinion, of the work that the TGA, the proactive work that the TGA took upon themselves in 2021 to reform and improve access to medical cannabis. They really quite radically transformed the patient access approval system and made it much easier to become an authorised prescriber and for those prescribers to provide cannabis to patients. And they should be congratulated for doing that, in my opinion. The growth that we've seen is really a result of their hard work, significantly as a result of their hard work. The challenge with these data, of course, is they don't tell us much. They don't tell us how many people there are, or how many patients there are, or how much people are accessing, or what they're accessing, or how much they're spending. Also, with the recent transition away from SASB towards AP approvals, we have even less data. So AP approvals, unlike SASB approvals, don't tell us patient age, patient gender, or even the primary indication for which access is given. So these data are used a lot, they're cited a lot because they're publicly available and people are familiar with them, and that's fine, but in my opinion, they're not terribly enlightening. Now to get to the meat of the presentation, this is sales of medical cannabis data in Australia. Now, clip, here we go. So if you're a product sponsor in Australia, so you're a company that's got a product in the market, it's required of you to report to the TGA every 6 months saying, these are all the products that I have in the market, and this is how many units of each product that I have sold. That data is accessible through Freedom of Information requests, which Penington Institute has done, and we've collected this data and analysed it and previously published it in some of our reports you can find on our website. This is de-identified data, so we don't know brand names, product names, and in fact there are some severe limitations to this data set, but what we do know is how many units of these products have been sold over time. 1 unit, just for clarity, is a bottle of oil or a jar of flour. We don't know anything more than that, so we don't know the price of the product, for example. As you can see, growth is strong. Very significant growth over time. The limitations with this data set include it relies on companies accurately and compliantly reporting their data to TGA, and we know that that doesn't happen, at least some of the time. We also don't know anything about compounding because compounded products don't require a product sponsor and therefore don't need to be reported through this process. How big compounding is a really great question that I would love some clarity on, as I'm sure many people would. And we also don't know how big a unit is. So, 1 unit of flour could be 3 grams or 10 grams, it could be $50 or $200. We don't know that either. But we do know some other things that we can drill into this data and look at. For example, we can look at how many units are sold by which access pathway. So this is the same data presented, but broken down by whether the unit was sold as a result of a SASB approval or an authorised prescriber approval. So this trend's very much similar to the approval data that we just saw. Clearly, it's authorised prescribers who are providing the vast majority of medical cannabis products to patients in Australia. And actually, if you look at the trend line for the SAS approvals, it's going down over time. So there are fewer units sold as a result of SASB approval as time goes on. So it's really all about authorised prescribers. And once again, that's a direct result of the TGA reforms. But of course, more work needs to be done to address the barriers to access, which I'm sure we'll hear lots about today. The key ones being, of course, the cost of products and the costs of medical consultations, the education of healthcare professionals, and the unequal treatment of medicinal cannabis patients when it comes to workplace and drug testing laws. We can also look at this data in terms of the format of the products that we're talking about. So this is the same data, once again, broken down by product format. Probably unsurprising to many people in this room that the growth that we've seen is predominantly driven by increase in sales of dried flower products. Oral liquid products in this data set have actually declined slightly in the most recent time period. Now, I know this is a bit out of date, so the data only covers 3 6-month time periods. The most recent one is the first half of 2023. So it's old data, and we'll see when the new data set comes out, hopefully in a few weeks, where that trend goes. But it's an interesting question. Why would unit oral liquid sales stagnate or decline? Perhaps it's a cost issue. Perhaps it's because these products have become bigger and more potent over time, and therefore people need to buy fewer individual units. We don't know. I'll point out that the other category here includes all other products. So these emerging product formats that I'm sure we'll hear a lot about today, vape pens, pastilles, topicals, concentrates. As far as this data is concerned, they really haven't captured any significant market share yet. The last slide that I'll show you on this data is just to drill down into the most recent time period. So this is the first half of 2023. And this is the same data broken down by the category of product. So for those who need a refresher, in Australia, all medical cannabis products are sorted into one of 5 categories. Category 1 is 98% CBD, category 5 is 98% THC, and the others range in between. And as you can see, this is a dried flower market, and it's a THC-dominant dried flower market. From January to June 2023, over 70% of every unit of medical cannabis sold in Australia was a Category 5 THC-dominant dried flower product. Lastly, I'll just touch briefly on some market sizing and forecasting with some really heavy caveats out the front. This is back-of-the-envelope calculations based on some assumptions that we've made. It's nothing to take to the bank, but it gives you a sense of where things might be trending. And this is work that's predominantly done by Cass that we collaborated on together. Cass put together a little model that accounts for things like price declines over time, shifts in market share, and growth rates. And we put in some assumptions, and these are the estimates. So we reckon that it's probably reasonable to say last year Australians spent about $400 million on medical cannabis products retail. And if things keep going the way they're going, there's no reason why this market wouldn't reach $700–800 million in a few years' time. But of course, the limitations with this data are the future is uncertain. No one knows what's going to happen, and we'll have to wait and see. So in summary, there is no single source of truth. The data is patchy. You can look at it from different angles and try to piece things together. And when you do that, one of the consistent things you see is strong growth despite these enduring barriers to patient access that still need to be addressed. It is very much a dried flower market, that's categorical. And the future is uncertain, but it's trending in the right direction. Lastly, that's it for my presentation. If you want to get in touch, you can do so via the details on the screen at the moment. And you can also access some of the research and reports that Pennington Institute have produced about cannabis in Australia. That's it for me. Thanks so much. I'll hand it back to Cass. Good time.
Perfect. Can everyone hear me? Perfect. Thank you all for having me here today. Thank you, MCIA, for inviting me, and Reese for an insightful presentation. Before I get started, I just want to point out people have nervous tics. Mine is sweating a bit when I do public presenting, so please bear with me if that happens. Before we get into the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about Honolly, just so you have some context from where the data comes from today. So Honolly is a patient-run cannabis education and medtech company with the mission to improve global well-being through cannabis education and access. We have 3 main digital products alongside our telehealth offering, which we launched recently. And the 3 are the honolly.com.au blog, which has content created with health professionals and experts for patients. We have our Catalyst Cannabis Medicines database, which is accessible by verified health professionals and verified patients, and that's where the majority of our data will come from today. And then we have our Scripts by Honolly platform. Where patients can upload e-scripts, look at a list of pharmacies, and order their medication online for pickup or delivery, and we guarantee patients RRP or less for their medicine. Our digital products allow us to offer consulting services, which have local and international clients, and we're really excited that the data that we capture from all of these channels will allow us to help inform industry and everyone really today and going forward. It's important for me to say that it's because of the product suppliers and the industry in general who helps us and supports us with our patient-focused offerings that makes this presentation here today possible. So thank you very much. We really appreciate it. We'll start with a quick overview. Thank you. And so we'll touch on product numbers first, and then go into country of origin, and we'll break that down by product type. We'll talk about pricing, specifically RRP. We'll touch very briefly on some terpenes. Then we'll talk about mainly category 5 flower, THC content. Now, I just want to point out, Reese talked a bit about sales data. I will not be talking about sales data. This is purely product numbers and SKUs that have entered the market over this time period. So we'll get started with some dose forms, product numbers, and current stats. So, as we can see from the graph on the screen, SKU numbers have, in most forms, have increased since 2022. Flour is the category that has skyrocketed and has actually grown 5-fold since 2022. Oils had their largest growth in half 2 2022, but have flattened, and this seems to be in line with what Reese mentioned about sales declining during that period. In terms of vape carts and other more accessible dose forms, they're on the rise, and vape carts, in fact, have more than doubled in half 2 2022, and then doubled again in half 1 2023. Pastilles, or gummies, are the new big thing, and this isn't really surprising as patients have been asking for them for quite some time now. Until this year, there were only 2 finished pastilles or gummies on the market, and since January 1 this year, 4 new products have been added to Catalyst, and we believe that that's going to continue to increase. Finally, we've seen an increase in concentrates, including dabs and other and topicals, and the introduction of patches and inhalers. Patients are looking for more accessible product formats, and those are the formats that are more accessible formats are what you'd think of in a traditional pharmaceutical market. They're coming in and requesting them specifically to replace things like oils, which can be messy and difficult to handle when you're on the move. Now, we don't see this impacting flour for a few reasons. One, because of the traditional nature of flour in medicinal cannabis and cannabis in general. 2, the effect and onset and duration of the flour products. And then 3, because there is a medrec market that is here and is very dominant. Now, we'll look at the country of origin for all products. Great. So prior to the July 1, 2023 TGA changes, there was a lot of concern that those changes would impact the product API and location of product imports, and therefore increase price to product suppliers, and as a result, increase price to patient. What we can see is that we have not just yet realized any of these changes or the relative percent of product company origins across all dose forms. I'll touch on specific dose forms next, and then we'll jump into some pricing. So we'll start with flour. There are 2 things that you can see from these graphs. First is the sheer growth of the flour category. The largest jump happened in half 2, 2023, reflected in the rightmost bar on the left chart. We don't see this slowing down. The second is that more companies are importing flour to be packaged locally. This is currently at about 60% of all flour products. And as a result, what we hope to see is that Australian manufacturers will increase capacity and efficiency mid to long term, therefore reducing price to the suppliers, and again, with a knock-on effect to reducing price to patient. Now, we'll touch on oils. So what we can see, and this is similar again to what Reese talked about before, is that total oil numbers peaked by January 23, and we think, and we have some speculation on what Reese said before, that's because a majority of the oils are CBD and THC only. Very few differentiate from each other in any way, and suppliers and healthcare professionals talk about oils as generics, and we hear this from them all the time. We believe we've reached a saturation point for these types of just plain old CBD and THC oils. With relation to the July 23 changes, it would have been reasonable to expect the number of products, particularly from countries like the US, to have decreased. However, at 1 January 24, we had 19 oil products on the market from the US, and many of those batches are probably not compliant with the current TGO regulations. Now, that's unsurprising because all of those batches were released prior to the July 23 changes. We do have confirmation from some suppliers that there are a number of these products that will continue to stay on the market because their manufacturing locations are compliant. And there was a recent announcement that a company in Colorado just received their TGA license, which means we will likely continue to see more oils coming from the US. Now, we'll talk about vape carts. So as you can see, the vape cart category is growing rapidly. Unlike other dose forms, vape carts are undergoing manufacturing and packaging in the same country as their API. When these products first hit the market, they were all from Canada. In half one, 2023, we saw the first liquid vape carts come from South Africa. And then in half two, 23, we saw our first vape carts from the US and Australia. This is another category that we see continuing to grow very rapidly and becoming slightly more diverse. Now, before we move into pricing, I'm going to do a quick recap for everyone. So when it comes to flower, since July 23, the distribution of country of origin has not changed, but we've seen packaging move more towards Australian manufacturers, and with flower, it's currently at about 60% of all packaging. In terms of oil, we haven't seen the impacts of July 23 changes yet, but we expect to see any changes that do occur over the next 18 months due to batch expiry. In terms of vape carts, this is a rapidly growing category, which we don't see slowing down, and the API and manufacturing are being done in the same country as their source API. We expect to see more vape carts entering the market from both local and overseas manufacturers. Now we'll talk about pricing, and we're going to focus on RRP. So while flower has seen the largest growth as a category, what we can see here is that it's slowly becoming a race to the bottom, and more recently, quicker. This is very resemblant of what's happening overseas. The most interesting thing to note is the massive decrease in the minimum price. Originally, the lowest priced products were on the market for concession patients only. As patient demand grew for lower priced products, product suppliers realized that they needed to get into that market, and in half one 2023, there was a drop of about 30% in the minimum price per gram. This created a clear market segmentation, so we now have two types of cannabis patients. One is interested in paying lower prices and is comfortable with average to good quality cannabis. The second is willing to pay more for higher quality products, but want to actually have higher quality products. The reality is that both of these segments will likely purchase from each of those price categories across their life cycle, and that's due to tolerance and wanting a rotation of flower for tolerance breaks. And secondly, because it's cannabis and people just want to try new things. The challenge for most suppliers is not going to change. This is providing expected quality at both the higher and low end price points, and doing this consistently, as well as not going out of stock. From our Scripts by Honolly ordering platform, what we're seeing is that these very low price products are selling very, very quickly, and the newer products are selling out of stock even more quickly. This is creating a challenge for patients and health professionals in terms of wanting to stay with those brands. Now, we'll talk about oil. So, as mentioned earlier, a major concern from the July 23 changes is that we're going to see products becoming more expensive, particularly in this category. Thus far, we haven't seen this happen. This is trending similar to flower in the sense that there was a significant decrease in the minimum price with only a modest decrease in the median price. The largest drop for the minimum price per milligram was in half two 2023, which was 40% and sounds like a lot, but really it was only 5 cents to 3 cents. Now, I'll touch on liquid vape carts. So this is trending similarly to what flower trended like early in its infancy. New products with the perception of higher quality entered the market, and for vapes, that was going from distillates to something like live resin. This created an increase in the maximum price per mil. What we expect to see is more products entering the market, which is currently happening, and we saw earlier from the graph, it's quite an aggressive trend. The minimum price will continue to decrease, but the maximum price will continue to increase for a bit longer because we still have new product formulations like live rosin, which is different from live resin, which will enter the market. Now, I'm going to touch on terpenes. So one thing that we have seen consistently trending upwards, unlike the graphs you see on the screen, is patient and health professional demand for terpene profiles that are actually verified. Terpenes have become a very important part of the medicinal cannabis selection process. Unfortunately, most suppliers are still talking the talk about big terpene profiles, while they're very rarely providing certificates of analysis from batch to batch showing that they can walk the walk. Patients and health professionals want more terpene information and consistently search on our platform, which means they're searching in other places, for terpene profiles. As you can see, the percentage of suppliers providing terpene data over the last few years has not increased, and this is a real missed opportunity. And to be very specific, that is providing certificates of analysis, verified terpene profiles from batch to batch. Now, before we move into a recap, I just want to touch on flower THC content, specifically for category 4 and 5. So what we saw was that flower prices are dropping. However, we can see here that THC percentage content of flower is increasing. Now, we see on the screen a 33% THC product, but just the other day, we saw that there's a 40% THC product from a compounding pharmacy. Some patients go, wow, this is great, and others in this room may say, maybe this isn't such a good thing. I'm with the latter, particularly when, although limited research shows that THC content isn't the best predictor of effect. The message that I want you all to take away from this slide is that we all have an important part of providing education, and we have a responsibility to help educate patients and health professionals, rather than just providing them high-content THC products on demand. It would be great to see suppliers providing mid to low-range products with consistently verifiable high terpene profiles, and in turn, clinics and health professionals would be able to educate patients more on why these lower THC products are valuable and going to be better for their health. So before we wrap up, I'll jump into a recap with some takeaways and some predictions. So in terms of the TGO 93 changes, we haven't realized an impact on the API source of location or price just yet, but since the changes, more manufacturing has moved to Australia, and particularly in flower, and we see this is likely to grow. In terms of inhalables, flower SKUs and THC content is growing, while price is dropping. Flower prices will continue to drop due to competition in the market. Vape carts and concentrates are gaining more momentum, and new products like live rosin will enter the market and continue to put more pressure in this area. In terms of emerging formats, what we've seen is that new dose forms like edibles are capturing a market share and will continue to do so. In terms of opportunities, patients are requesting more accessible dose formats and want to see the same dose formats that are existing overseas, and we're beginning to see product suppliers helping with that. Transparency around terpene profiles is big. You can differentiate yourself from your competitors and build trust with both health professionals and patients by providing verified terpene information consistently. The one other thing to mention is improving stock management. This is really important, especially when it comes to the lower price flower products. Patients are becoming extremely frustrated with products that are out of stock, and they're then telling their health professionals that this is a problem as well. We know that a lot of product selection is driven by patients. Both the patients and prescribers are moving away from products that are out of stock, and competitors keep coming in with products that are lower priced, so there's a continuous switch from brand to brand. So if you want to keep your patients, you need to have stock. Finally, I'm going to wrap up with some predictions. So in terms of the July 23 changes, API location changes, particularly for oil, will be realized over the next 18 months with batch expiring. More companies in North and South America are applying for and going to receive their TGA licenses, which will increase again the number of imports. In terms of inhalables, new brands will enter the market, and I said brands, not sponsors or suppliers, because these will be brands with very targeted marketing strategies for both that patient looking for the lower, cheaper flower product and higher flower products. And concentrates will continue to take a market share, and new concentrates like live rosin will also enter the market and start to shake things up. In terms of emerging medicine, demand for accessible formats will increase and be filled, and gummies in particular are going to take off. Prices will decrease for these products, and that's partially because we're seeing more finished goods, but in terms of edibles, it's mainly going to be from the compounding pharmacies because they're putting a lot of pressure on the market. I think that's all I've got for you today. Yep, thank you very much. I hope you found this insightful and beneficial. I'd like to leave you with one thought. So for those of you who have found the presentation that Reese and I have done today helpful, that you feel that it helps your business and helps the industry grow, my question for you is, as an industry, how can we work more collaboratively to get more comprehensive and accurate data sets? Thank you for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.
We'll need a handheld mic up here, please. Oh, you got them. Great. Okay, perfect. And the lapel's on. Thank you. So I'm going to kick off the panel discussion. Actually, you've opened it quite well, Tom, and Sharon, I'll come back in just a moment because I've got a question I want to ask you. You've just put it to the room, how can we work more collaboratively to get a better picture of the industry? What are the solutions that you see? What do you think can be done?
Thanks for the question. So one of the things that was actually brought to my attention by one of the product suppliers who's in this room was that in other industries, independent organizations are provided with in our case, the product supplier's sales data. And those independent organizations can then compile that sales data and provide it back to industry de-identified. It's something that we've spoken with a number of suppliers about, and they've said they're happy to share that data with us. So, you know, we are independent. I guarantee you we will not have any products in this market, at least until recreational cannabis is legalized, and we have no interest in supplying products into this market. So it's something that we're looking at doing, reaching out to more of the suppliers and seeing if they're comfortable with us having that sales data, compiling it anonymously, and then being able to provide it back to the industry. Generally, I think people, you know, as Reese mentioned earlier, there are suppliers that aren't actually providing their data to the TGA in a timely manner or at all. So making sure that everyone's doing that. And then also some of these closed loop, vertically integrated operations being a bit more forthcoming with information would help the industry as well.
Reece, have you got anything to add to that?
Oh, no, that's perfect. A perfect summation. I think the challenge with the TGA data that I presented is that data was never meant to be market data that was meant to be usable. Like this is a bit of an opportunistic workaround to take advantage of a data set that's being collected for a different purpose. So it's not reasonable to expect the TGA to put effort into improving that in the way that I would hope them to do. But if it is a regulatory requirement or an expectation that companies report completely inaccurately, I would like to see that enforced. But that's quite low down on the priority list of regulations I would like to see more enforced in this industry.
Sharon, I'd like to draw a line from the data to the patient experience. We've heard about the market today, the story being it's a growth market, it's very competitive, we're very much still relying on imports, cannabis is becoming more mainstream, prices are decreasing, whilst flower still dominates, we do have some new emerging formats coming through. What are the things that have come out in the data that you believe are most impacting the patient experience, whether sort of for good or for bad?
Hi everyone, thank you for coming. With patients, they're really divided into a couple of groups. If you put your mind back, I was told a long time ago that the average age of knowledge of the human body for anyone is the age of 12. We actually stop learning because science is not enforced. So with patients, they don't have that knowledge, a lot of them, to know what's going on. So a lot of them are very price driven, that's one thing. Also the unrealistic expectations of patients. Because of the way it's advertised on social media and other blogs, rightly or wrongly, they think it's a magical one dose, one cure. And when we're talking about patients who are on a lower income, they really expect that to happen. And they can get very frustrated and very angry if it's not done that way. So for a lot of patients, price driven is very much there. And we have people come in and they say, what is the best price? What's the cheapest on the market? How can we get better value for money? And one of the things we saw was the drop off in oils. And what I've actually seen is doctors prescribing higher doses, or higher strengths, but patients are taking lower doses, and that will be influencing the market. So I don't think there's a decrease in the use of oils. What we're seeing though is a decrease in the number that are being purchased due to the higher strength being prescribed.
Do you see any correlation between pricing and where the products are coming from?
No. And a short answer. We were actually talking, Angelica and I were talking about how many people ask us. It's very, very rare that we'll be asked what the country does it come from. Price and quality are the two main drivers. We're starting to see terpenes be asked a little bit more, but then we've been advocating that from day one.
What about you guys?
Tom knows the started better than I do, but I looked at it a little while ago, and it was really encouraging to see that, you know, if you look at all of the products and price per gram or price per milligram, some of the cheapest products on the market are cultivated in Australia. which is great because I remember, plenty of people will say, oh, well, how could Australia possibly compete with the Canadian industry or the South African industry? They've got all this scale, but we forget that, Australia cultivates cotton, for goodness sakes. Like, we export rice. Like, there's agricultural know-how here that works really well for other commodities also. Yeah.
I was surprised by the country of origin data, and I kind of hoped that we would see Australia higher in those graphs or having a greater share of those graphs by now. What do you think, Tom, I'll start with you, what do you think it's going to take to see Australia gain share in terms of country of origin?
I think we're beginning to see Australia producing more flour. I think when you talk to suppliers, a lot of it is about the regulatory environment, and people are just catching up. I mean, a lot of these markets are, for recreational or medical purposes, are already far advanced in terms of what we have here. And so I think we're going to just see over time more products coming into the market from Australia as more grows get up and running, become more sophisticated. And also, I think while I agree with Sharon that a lot of patients don't ask about country of origin, I do think once we start to see a bigger influx of products from Australia, it will become more front of mind. I also think that if we start to see maybe a bit more review of products from the TGA, and we start to see that maybe some of these products aren't actually compliant with what it should be, the Australian products will become more popular and more sought after by health professionals and therefore by patients.
Anything to add to that, Sharon?
I think definitely as time goes on, and if the prices come down, because we've got to remember Australia is an extreme temperature country, and the price of air conditioning and keeping the product nice is really quite expensive here. So if that sort of can come to a level where it is sustainable, then you will see it grow. There's a lot more people who will sometimes come in and say, is it here or not, but then they choose products that more value for their pocket. And by that I don't mean cost per milligram or cost per gram, it's total cost, because we've got to work in with their budget. And to say someone it's going to cost you 0.2 of a cent or 12 cents, that doesn't mean anything to them. They're looking at it in whole dollar value.
We've heard this morning that prices are coming down, which is great news for patients, and we know that we've achieved a position which is much more at parity with the illicit market. I was pretty surprised by that 70% of medical patients are still going through that channel. Sharon, I'd like to know, as a clinic owner and dispensary, why do you think that channel is still so strong, that we aren't seeing more patients come through the
I'd hate to
pathways?
say it, but price on the street, it was at one stage it was cheaper than medicinal cannabis. Now we're finding that it's nearly equal, so we'll start to see more and more people come across. Unfortunately, we're also seeing more and more dealers come through, and more prosecutions of dealers getting it through the medical system and then on selling it. So it is out there, it's just not being done legally.
Tom, have you heard much about this from the sort of Honolulu side of things?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say that any one thing that I'm about to say is the reason, but the things that we see patients saying consistently are prices of consultations, which, again, depends on the clinic. Some of them are super cheap. People not understanding the type of clinic or health professional they're going to, being locked into a system and then saying, well, I don't want any of this, I can't leave, because they're being given sometimes false information about going to a different clinic and saying, well, I'm just going to go to the black market because I know I can choose and get what I want. There's also, like Sharon said, price is a real challenge, and as I mentioned before, product suppliers going out of stock. And I guess product suppliers going out of stock, the way that doctors are writing prescriptions, not allowing for any form of substitution, then the patient says, well, now I have to go back to my doctor and pay more money even though I've been prescribed a product that's out of stock or discontinued. They don't feel they should have to go back for a substitution there, which I tend to agree with. You don't have to agree with me. And just the general challenges of having to wait for that. We see a lot of patients ordering out of stock products that they've been prescribed, and then the pharmacist goes back to the clinic and says, hey, this is out of stock, can I do a substitution? And the clinic will say, no, they have to come back for a consult. When's the next consult? 2 weeks. Okay, well, am I going to wait 2 weeks to get medicine? No, I'm going to go get it from the guy down the road. And that is something we see very consistently.
Sharon, can you tell us a little bit more about out of stocks and what you're hearing from your patients?
They are extremely frustrated with the out of stocks, and what Tom says is correct. They don't like it. If they're stable on something, they don't want to change, and it really is the biggest, I guess, gripe from patients, and they do turn that sometimes anger onto the pharmacy staff. But I have to say that out of stocks and inconsistent supply is the biggest issue, and they hate it.
Got any advice for the sponsors who are grappling with this from the other side?
Honestly, I don't think there is a single answer that we do. All I can say is it's getting better, but with the changes that happened last year and that they're filtering through the market at the moment, we've probably got at least another 6 to 12 months of this happening.
Reece, have you got any thoughts on that?
I mean, not an informed thought, but I mean, like it's all about prioritization, right? Like as a product sponsor, you know, you have to make trade-offs between quality, price, volume, your cash flow, in order to, if a company was trying to prioritize and maximize having products in stock, then they would necessarily need to invest more upfront to have more on hand, and that's an expense that they have to wear, and that's a risk. So it's understandable why these things happen. I think just over time, as these companies become bigger and more sophisticated, I mean, most of these companies that are operating in Australia weren't companies a few years ago, let alone the companies working in a very challenging, logistically challenging, challenging from a regulatory perspective market. So I think it's unfortunately entirely predictable, and probably time will be the only solution. Yeah.
It's interesting, this conversation keeps circling back to price. And I quite liked the reframe you gave, Sharon, of talking about value rather than price. What can you tell us about how patients are making those value calculations? What's important to them in determining value instead of thinking about price?
It really ties back to the dosing and how much they're taking, if they're taking it consistently, and if they see a benefit. If they see a benefit, regardless, they'll keep on using and buying and purchasing and going back to the doctors. If they find that they've been given a product that doesn't work for them the first time round, then a lot of the time they'll end up walking away and going back to their own GP and the opioids and other medicines.
Tom, is your experience the same in your group?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Sharon absolutely there. I think that maybe doesn't take into account the more recreational consumer, and I personally believe that a lot of the medicinal cannabis market is both medical and recreational, and we see that quite often. And when it comes to that type of patient, it is about bag appeal. So what does the product look like? How big are the buds? And I want to be clear, I'm not necessarily saying that should matter. I'm just saying what I'm hearing. And we see that even with some of the newer, lower price products that are coming out, which are actually meant to be smaller buds, not looking as nice. And that's pretty clear from the branding and what's going on. You know, it's pretty clear that that's what it's going to be. And even then, patients go, well, hang on, I didn't realize this. So I think there is also a bag appeal thing. And I think over the last year or so, many more of the companies have realized that that's an important part of it. So, yeah.
I'm going to throw to the room in a minute for some questions. So if we've got a roving mic and you've got a question, please pop your hand up and Patty will bring the microphone around. Tom, you just mentioned appeal, and we talked about some of the emerging formats earlier and the desirability of some of the overseas formats that we're seeing. What do you think the market's going to look like in a few years' time in terms of market share of different delivery formats?
I think that's going to be entirely up to the doctors. I know patients want certain things, but again, the doctors and the prescribers are the gatekeepers. I think that, you know, we've seen different types of concentrates come out, and I know there was a lot of talk, at least from people we speak with, like, oh, is that actually going to get prescribed? And yeah, we're seeing, you know, dabs being prescribed now. So I think we will continue to see the market look more like what it is overseas. We're always going to have prescribers who are more comfortable with harm reduction. And again, I personally believe that's an important part of this, especially when prescribers can actually prescribe something like that and then teach the patient how to use it in a better way than they currently are. But yeah, I think we're going to begin to see a more recreational style product mix come out and be prescribed. Probably quite limited for a while, but we will see it more and more.
What are your thoughts, Reese?
I mean, if you look overseas, if you look at North American markets, what you see is pre-rolled products. So, you know, smokable, pre-rolled cannabis cigarettes. You know, that seems to be pretty consistent across like the US and Canadian markets. You know, but it seems unlikely that that sort of product format would really make it into Australia's current medical cannabis framework. Although I probably would have said the same thing about concentrates and dabs a few years ago, you know, so who knows? Yeah.
Taryn?
Well, it will be interesting to see, but one of the other things, I guess, that's driving a lot of our patients is how can they use their cannabis outside of their home? How can they do it discreetly? Vaping or smoking flower is not discreet, and that's probably what's driving a lot of the MCARTs that people are using. It's nice and discreet, as are the inhalers. So you've got people coming from that point of view as well, and being driven by the hospitals where they're far more comfortable with people using an inhaler or a small liquid cart than they are with people being sent out to vape flower, and that's a big push as well.
I'm going to come to a question over there in just a minute. Before I do, one of the things that we didn't touch on today is the shift that's happening in patient demographics. We know that patients are getting older. What do you think is being mirrored in terms of the delivery formats? Is that driving a change in demographics? Reese, I'm looking at you, so I'm going to let you answer this question.
Well, I mean, like, unfortunately, in terms of patient demographic data, the only, like, the most useful publicly available data set we have for that is the SASB approval data, which, as we've hopefully demonstrated, you know, can't be relied on to indicate much. But it does help track changes in composition, even though it might not be representative. It is representative, but it's not comprehensive, is what I meant to say. And analysis of the SASB approval data has shown that actually patient age has tended to trend downwards over time. So patients have gotten younger from 2019 to now, roughly, in terms of the SASB approval data. And that's probably because most cannabis in Australia is consumed by people between the ages of 18 and 35 for medical or non-medical reasons.
It's interesting, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare tells a slightly different picture in their data, which is one of the problems we have in terms of reporting on the industry. What are you seeing in the real world in terms of patient demographics? Are they the same as they've been? Are they changing?
They're definitely changing. The range of patient age we have, I think the youngest patient we have who gets in medicinal cannabis is 6. The oldest was 98. But what we're seeing is a lot more older people come through. That's not reflected in the data because it's all been done under the AP system. But we've seen probably a very rapid rise for older people. Now, by that I mean over the age of 55, but a big group also over the age of 70. And that's with their children bringing them in. And that's what we're seeing anyway, but that won't be reflected anywhere in the data.
I'm going to go to questions now. Paddy, we had a question over there.
Hi there. Thanks a lot for all the insights you've provided this morning. I was wanting to know if any of the data sets you've used provide information regarding repeat purchase by patients. What proportion of patients are trying once or twice a couple of times and finding the products are not helping them? And what proportion of patients keep on buying because the products work?
No. Unfortunately, yeah, I don't think so. Some of the SASB approval data that some colleagues from the Lambert Initiative and I were playing around with a couple of years ago included included sufficient information to infer, who was a repeat patient or not. Wasn't very reliable, but that's quite old now, and I can't even conjure it up from my memory, unfortunately. Sorry, that was a really pointless answer.
Tom, anything in your data?
Not really. I mean, we do have the scripts ordering platform, but I'd be hesitant to say anything about that just yet. I think we need quite a bit more data to be able to say what return patients are looking like.
Sharon, is this something that you monitor at all at Medigreen?
No, it's not, because patients, while they come in, they'll often say whether it's working or not, and because a lot of them, if it's not, we encourage them to go back to their doctors. It's probably one of the reasons why we're seeing that increase in higher strength oils and vapes because of that. It's boiling down to cost as much as effect.
We have a question over there.
Hi everyone, thanks very much for putting up the data. I think a lot of that is in the public domain already, but it's great to have the voiceover because it really helps us interpret it. One of the things I picked up is that I think, Reese, you said about 1.2 million scripts or products of flour have been sold in the last year. If I take that as a 10-gram jar, and I know it could be 15 or 10, but just for ease of maths, my brain's not that great, that's about 12 tons a year of flour. Does anybody have any idea how much is produced and imported versus the 12 tons that we know is sold?
Yeah. Do you happen to have those figures on hand, Cass, the ODC figures?
I don't.
So we do. There is some information available. If you go to the Office of Drug Control website, they've recently published figures on the volume of cannabis that's imported and the volume of cannabis that's cultivated domestically for calendar year 2022, I think. Which, yeah, of course. And it's always going to be that long lag, unfortunately. But you're aware of that data. I mean, that would be the only.
Sorry, there's an exponential increase in the uptake of flour and an exponential increase in the amount of product that's being produced by local producers and also imports. So I'm just trying to say, is there, because 12 tons, I think that if you ask the Australian producers here, we're producing 12 tons alone. So where's the mass balance going? Because if we're producing 12 tons, consumers buying 12 tons, but 70% of it is imported, something isn't adding up.
Something's not adding up, yeah. I think it's also, I think there's a challenge with that data set because overwhelmingly all the flour that was imported to Australia is likely to be packaged and sold as flour. Whilst not all of the flour that's cultivated in Australia will end up as dried flour, a lot of it, some of it, an amount of it will go to extraction and a tiny fraction will go to exports. So that's probably some of the difference. But then, of course, we don't have, like the data that I presented doesn't consider compounding. And depending on who you talk to, compounding might be 10 or 20% or more in addition to those volumes. That's just completely invisible.
Yeah, and I think that's fair enough because if it's something, it has to be something.
Yeah, the data, once again, is not very good,
This is part of the problem of this.
That's what we should have titled this session, actually.
True.
The data is not very good.
We have another question over here.
Oh yeah, good morning everyone. Good to see you, Tom and Reese, Cassandra. At the Lambert Initiative, we're kind of bored with THC and CBD, so my question was about other more interesting candidates and whether you know if current products are sneaking through, for example, CBDA or CBN or CBG. Do we have an enhanced palette out there in the 500 odd products that we're perhaps not aware of? Or are there products in the horizon? How are they going to be treated by regulators?
Sharon, would you like to kick that off?
I'm not really quite sure how to answer that one and give you a good one there, but there's a lot of different things that put holds on the market, and along with the data that we're seeing, one of the reasons for having that big gap is, and there's a good question, do we include non-PBS pharmacies? Do we include other things? That data's probably missing. And so it's very hard to give you an out-and-out answer as to what would be the answer for that one.
And Tom, minor cannabinoids, what are you seeing through your group?
Yeah, so in terms of product types, there are definitely products with minor cannabinoids are on the rise very slowly. There are quite a few companies that are starting to bring out individual products. I think we have a CBG and maybe a CBG vape cart. And we definitely have in terms of compounding, there's a lot being done for minor cannabinoids. I think we've also, there are some oils that have started to publish their minor cannabinoid profile consistently. That's also the label claims. And so, yeah, we are beginning to see that happening, but it's still few and far between.
Compounding's interesting. It seems as though there's almost a little bit of a space for innovating new product formulations, seeing how they go, and then launching them into the market.
There is one company who's doing that now. They have a pretty interesting range that is compounded and are looking for a company to hopefully turn them into finished goods. And it's a very interesting mix of product types, and a very interesting mix of minor cannabinoids, which include your acidic forms, CBN, CBG, and some others.
Tom, you mentioned in your presentation that some companies will start, or brands, you used the language brands, will start to specialise in specific areas. And Ian, I can think of at least one company who are going out to the market specialising more in that minor cannabinoid area. Adam.
Good morning, and panel, thank you very much for the insights, much appreciated. Sharon and Tom, directed towards both of you, we had a question regarding repeat of patients, but from a script repeat perspective, Sharon, from a point of sales, and how many repeats do you see typically filled on a script? So if there's 10 repeats, how many of those are actually getting filled by a patient? And secondary to that, what are the factors of consideration that create the dynamics for the patient to come back and fill that script, considering the plethora of option and the accessibility, or the ease of accessibility with the rise of free clinics and so on and so forth? So just to repeat, how many scripts are getting filled, and what are the reasons that they're getting filled?
When it comes to repeats, it's very dependent on what the doctor writes, and how many get filled is also dependent on the patient knowledge. The short life of a prescription for cannabis for 99% of the products is only 6 months. So on a typical patient, if they've got 5 or 6 repeats, most of those will get filled, especially if they are flower. We also have a lot that expire, and I would say on a monthly basis, as we go through the prescriptions, getting rid of the ones that have expired, it could be anywhere from 15 to 20% that won't be picked up on a given time. For those who have the more generous repeats, I will say virtually none of them pick up all their repeats.
We've got time for one more question. I'm going to throw to Martin.
Thank you, Cass. It's Martin from Cannabis here. So my question is, over the last kind of 2 or 3 years, I think every cannabis conference I've been to, the refrain has been, if only we had better data. And in an environment where it's quite competitive, capital's hard to come by, companies seem reluctant to share that data, but complain there isn't enough data. How do we avoid a situation where in 3 years' time you guys aren't sitting on a panel saying, if only we had better data?
No matter how good the data is, Martin, I'll always say, why can't we have better data? Always. You can never have too much, and it can never be good enough. But I think it goes back to Tom's comment earlier. There's space for, everyone wants data, but no one wants to be the first one to put their gun down. But if there's a space or a framework where people feel comfortable doing that, I think that would go a long way. There's also the fact that you can appeal to people's commercial self-interest along those lines. Also, for example, the Nostradata slide that Cass showed us earlier, that's tremendous data, but it's incomplete. And so if you're the market leader and you have Nostradata data that says, look how wonderful I am, but everyone else in your industry goes, yeah, but it's not complete, you have a vested interest in increasing the completeness of that data in order to bolster your perceived position, which you can then take to investors. So I think it's, if you want to be able to say confidently to someone, I'm selling this many units, or I have this share of the market, then it's in your interests to ensure that we have an accurate picture of what that market is.
I couldn't agree more. I have a a lot of people coming to me asking me about market data and then complaining that we've got these data gaps. But the sponsors aren't doing what they're meant to do in terms of reporting. So this is a two-way street, and we do need to collaborate in order to get a better picture of what's going on across the industry. We're out of time. Thank you, everybody, and thank you to our panellists. It's morning tea time. Morning tea is sponsored by Federation University. Enjoy the break.